Hi there, everyone, and welcome to Paper Wishes Weekly Webisodes. I'm Sarah Newman, and I'm excited to bring you the 10th episode of Mixed Media the Paper Wishes Way. This week, we'll finish our series on heat embossing. We're going to explore two of my favorite techniques, stencil embossing and reverse stencil embossing. Today's projects feature the beautiful Butterfly Meadows paper pack and stencils from hot off the press, plus glitter embossing powders from WOW. And we'll take a closer look at each of these items in today's webisode. As you can see, we have a lot to explore, and I'm really glad you're joining us. So come play with us. Let's start with our embossing powders. We'll be working with 3 glitter embossing powders from our friends at WOW. And these come in a set of 3 called a trio, and you can see the gorgeous colors here. So we have aquamarine, peridot, and tanzanite. And this set was designed by British artist Tracy Scott. And knowing Tracy, I can just hear her say, I like a bit of sparkle. And these definitely have sparkle, and you can see this in the swatches here. Now, as I mentioned, they are glitter-based, which is going to give you a different look in contrast to regular embossing powders. And there are also some tricks to using them, which we'll talk about today. Now, I do want to point out here on the tanzanite swatch, where I've got a bit of sparkle around this area here, but I think you can see this dull section right here. Now, I wanted you to see this because this dull area is from overheating, which can happen when you're embossing any kind of powder. But it really stands out more when you do it on glitter embossing powders. So the first tip is when you emboss, you'll want to heat from underneath your cardstock and take care not to overheat with your heat tool. We'll talk a little bit more about that, plus some other tips in today's webisode. As you can see, these colors are a perfect match with the Butterfly Meadows paper pack. Now this set has 12 sheets of 12-inch by 12-inch papers, 2 of each designs, and the colors are really rich and beautiful. And you'll also have a sheet in here of cutouts with some of my favorite label sentiments on here too. Those make really quick and easy card focals and great for the inside of your cards too. Now the powders are also perfect for background techniques like the ones we've seen in our mixed media number 8 and number 9 videos. And they work really well with stencils too. So the ones that I'm using today are 6-inch by 6-inch stencils from hot off the press, and you can use them for so many different techniques. But today, as I mentioned, we'll be stenciling and reverse stenciling with embossing powder. And we'll be playing with, this one is the first one, all over swirls. We also have the woven lattice, artful mannequin, and then there's also the dahlia. We have a fancy frame and the fancy heart and words. So now that we've seen our supplies, let's jump into the first technique, stencil embossing. You can see the stencil embossing on these cut strips here on the front of my card, and this pattern is from the Woven Lattice stencil, and I use the peridot to emboss through it. That's going to give you that beautiful tone-on-tone effect that really works so perfectly with those Butterfly Meadows papers. It's a really easy technique to do. Now, before I get into the demo, first, I want to just share a quick little tip with you. Now, this is from Marian Emberson, and she is the embossing expert over at WOW. And she always suggests shaking the jar really well before you're using it, just to make sure that all of that glitter is properly mixed. So you can shake it, you can also stir it. And that's what I like to do. So just to make sure that all of that glitter is thoroughly mixed. I use a metal awl or a pokey tool for this. Now you do want to make sure not to use anything plastic, like one of those little plastic spoons or something like that. WOW powders and jars are specially treated to be anti-static. And if you use plastic or you introduce plastic to the jar or to the embossing powder, you will also introduce static to it. And so you do want to make sure to avoid using any plastic when you're working with your embossing powders. Now, the other important thing, don't decant your embossing powders into a plastic tub. I know a lot of people do that, but that also introduces static into the mix, and it will result in that powder sticking in places you don't want it to. So it's just really important for your WOW powders to be kept in the jars that they come in. Okay, I think I'm all mixed up and ready to go. So I'm going to bring in a piece of just plain white cardstock. I think this will help you to see the high contrast, especially with this beautiful embossing powder. And I'm going to work with the Fancy Hearts and Word stencil. Now you'll notice on here that I've got 3 elements on here. I've got a nice big beautiful heart. I've also got the word love, and I also have a sentiment on here too. Now if I want to emboss only one portion of the stencil, I'm going to need to do some masking. And so that's what I wanted to show you here. So I'm going to pop this down onto my white piece of cardstock. I just place that down. Now I've got some pieces of scrap paper. You can see really scrap paper just rescued from my recycling bin. And I'm just going to tack those down right on top using a little bit of masking tape. And that's going to block off the areas of the stencil that I don't want to emboss. Now I also need to have my Wow embossing ink pad on hand, and I also have a folded piece of scrap paper, and that's going to catch my excess embossing powder, and then I will be working with the beautiful Tanzanite embossing powder. So I'm going to get myself all sorted to go here. All I need to do is take my embossing ink pad and simply press it down through the stencil onto my white cardstock. Now, I'm not trying to squash it down, I'm just pressing it pretty thoroughly. I want to make sure that that ink is going through the stencil. And so I generally go around, a couple of times just to make sure that I've gotten that ink on there really well. Okay. Let's do one more little area over here. I think I've got it. Now the next step for this is, of course, trying to carefully remove my masking piece on here while keeping the stencil in place. I don't ever want to slide off that stencil because that will smear the embossing ink. And then I just want to lift this straight up. There we go. Okay. And then the next part, of course, is going to be putting this into my scrap piece of paper. And then I'm just going to add that beautiful embossing glitter on here. You can see just all of that sparkle and shine just as I'm putting this down, like so. And I think I can do another little round over here to make sure we've got all of those areas covered. Now you can see I do have some stray embossing glitter on here in all of the areas where my hands and fingers were. So this is the oil from your hand can really also make that embossing powder stick in various places. So do be sure to handle things carefully. Now with excess powder like this, I always recommend you go in with a fluffy brush. A dry paintbrush will do the trick, and just shuffle off some of that excess embossing powder. And I think you can see how easily that comes off. But look at that beautiful design and look at the sparkle and the shine on here. Okay, so I think that's good enough for demonstration purposes. And then I'm going to go ahead and heat set this. So before I do that, I'm going to move my scrap piece of paper out of the way. Now remember, again, with our overheated example earlier in the webisode, you don't want to blast straight from the top with your heat tool. Instead, you're going to want to heat set from underneath. So that's what I'm going to do. If you can give me just a minute, I'll be heat setting and then we'll take a look. Okay, now I think my piece has all been heat set. You can see that beautiful sparkle and shine on there, and also really that beautiful detail that we're able to get here on this heart image as well. So you've got some sparkle and you've got some shine. Absolutely beautiful. Okay, I'm going to bring back in my original card and we can take another look at this. So as I mentioned, I use the woven lattice here on these cut strips. Now sometimes we see an overall design like that lattice and we think we need to use the entire thing just the way it comes. But I really do like cutting apart the design just to get a completely different look. Now here I've also used the oval and scalloped cutting dies from Hot Off the Press to die cut a portion of the pattern paper. And here are some of the cutouts from the pack. Here's a couple of little butterflies and then also one of those label sentiments that I like so much. Now on the inside, we just have some simple strips again of the pattern embossed design and also some dazzles and another one of the sentiments on here. So this is how to do your stencil embossing. Now here's another example, one that I just did quite quickly actually. And this one is using only the word sentiments from the Artful Mannequin stencil. So you can see I've just used this area, masking off the other elements as we just saw. So don't forget you can use just portions of the design if you want to as well. Now another little tip that I want to make sure that you know is that you can also in many cases flip the stencil over. So not so much with the words, but if you can see the butterflies on here, I embossed the butterflies using the Peridot onto some of this background paper, and then I flipped the stencil over so I was able to get the reverse design on here too. So if you have butterflies, for example, that are going in one direction, just flip over the stencil and go ahead and do the embossing on the other side and you can get the mirror image. So that works really well as well, especially if you have some images that are kind of going in one direction or another. Just gives you another option there as well. So this is stencil embossing. Let's take a look at reverse stencil embossing. Here on my background, you can see a sparkly swirl pattern. Now this has been created using the all over swirl stencil with aquamarine embossing glitter and the reverse stenciling technique. It is such an easy technique to do and one that gives you double duty for a lot of your stencil designs. So let's take a look at how to do this. I'm going to set aside my card sample and I'm going to bring in just a stack of some scrap paper. So I'm going to have that on hand. And my swirl stencil. I'm going to pop that right down on top of this scrap paper. Now I'm going to do my stenciling onto some white cardstock, so I'll have that on hand and just set that aside. A couple of other things I need to have, of course, my scrap paper for catching my excess embossing powder and the embossing powder itself. And I'll be using the Peridot for this one. So I have that already pre-stirred, so I'm ready to go. Now the other thing that I have is a little mister bottle of water, and I've got that ready to go as well. Of course, I need to have my embossing ink pad, and this is where I'm going to start. So with my stencil placed on top of my scrap paper, I'm just going to take my embossing ink pad and press it on top of the stencil. So I'm not worried about creating a design underneath the stencil, which is why I've got that scrap paper under there. I'm trying to get as much ink as I can onto the stencil itself. And with an all-over design, of course, you can ink up as much or as little as you want to. Okay, now that the ink is on there, I'm going to grab that mister bottle and just give a quick spritz with water. Then I'm going to take this scrap paper and I'm just going to flip it over. So I'm working onto kind of cleanish side over here. And pop that down again. Then I'll take my real cardstock, my real surface, and put this on top. I'm going to hold down one area of it and then burnish the rest of it with my other hand. So I want to hold it down so it doesn't slide around. And then I can just simply rub the paper and make sure that I've got contact with all of that embossing ink. And then just lift off your design. You can set these things aside and then add your embossing powder. So I'm going to bring in my scrap paper and my embossing glitter and just sprinkle that right on top And then I'll just kind of let that slide off. And there you can see the beautiful design on there. And so then all I need to do is just heat set this. Again, I'll be heat setting from underneath and working quite slowly to make sure that I get all of those areas heat set and melted without overdoing it. And then I will have a beautiful, shiny, and sparkly design. So it's a great way to maximize your stencils. And in fact, I'm going to set this aside since I know you guys know how to heat set by now. I'm going to pop that aside. And then I also want to show you, this is the all over swirls. This is it with it reverse stenciled like we just saw. So you can see how it's getting a much more delicate design. Here it is with the embossing through the stencil like we saw with our first example. And you can see that there's a lot heavier application in here. So you're able to get two very different looks from one stencil, which I think is just fantastic and really does give you an extra look from all of your stencil designs. Okay, so let me bring back in my original card here. And you can see that I've kept things pretty simple on the rest of the card. I've just got a cutout here from the butterfly paper pack, added a few little flat back pearls on here. Again, one of those sentiments. I've got some dazzles here and just a little bit of ribbon. You don't need to have a whole lot else going on here. On the inside, I have more dazzles and then just a portion of that beautiful patterned paper on the inside. Now, one question you might have on the stencils is how to clean them. I just run them under the faucet with a bit of dishwashing soap and let them dry, and they are ready to use again. So very easy to take care of as well. So I hope that these techniques are giving you some inspiration as you look at your stencil stash and consider some new ways to get even more use from them. Thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for being a part of the Paper Wishes family. We're so glad that you're here with us. I can't wait to see what you create as you explore mixed media the Paper Wishes way. Do be sure to leave a comment. We love to hear what you think. Each item can be purchased separately, and you can see them below. However, we've also bundled them into a creative money saver just for you. For the money saver, just see this webisode on paperwishes.com.